The first time anyone at the shelter laid eyes on Gerald Marks, they thought he was lost. He wasn't from that side of town, didn't speak like them, and carried the quiet kind of sadness that made people uncomfortable. At 61, Gerald had already lived 3 lives. First as a young man chasing the American dream, then as a husband and father, and finally, painfully, as a widower wandering through the ruins of a life he never imagined ending alone. He arrived in South Baton Rouge not to find peace, but to give something back. Or maybe, if he was honest, to feel needed again. The women's shelter was tucked behind a crumbling church, surrounded by the sounds of sirens and cicadas. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't safe, but it was a place where people were trying to rebuild from nothing. Gerald walked in wearing a pressed shirt and slacks that didn't match the sweat-stained walls or the voices echoing down the halls. The director, Miss Thelma, didn't ask too many questions. She'd seen all kinds come through the door. Addicts, runaways, the broken, the guilty, the kind. She just looked into his eyes and said, "You ever mop a floor before, Mr. Marks?" "Ma'am," he replied. "I've mopped up more messes than I can count. But I'm here to clean something deeper, if that makes sense." And so he was handed a badge, a volunteer, just another pair of hands to do the things no one else wanted to. But every woman in that shelter noticed something different about Gerald. The way he waited for them to speak first. The way he looked them in the eye, not through them. The way he offered help without asking what they'd done to end up there. 7 women stayed long-term at the shelter, all widowed, all with stories that could silence a room. There was Clarice, 38, sharp-tongued and protective of everyone like a lioness. Maribel, 33, with hands always busy, folding, fixing, stitching her way through grief. Keisha, 29, soft-spoken and slow to trust, but with a laugh that warmed the coldest days. And then there was a younger group, 3 in their mid-20s, whose husbands had died in tragic accidents, violence, or simply vanished in the chaos of the streets. Yolanda, 26, who cooked for everyone and rarely spoke. Danica, 25, who kept a diary no one was allowed to touch. And Rosalind, just 24, who sang lullabies to no one in particular. The last was Naomi, 41, the unofficial matriarch of the group. She wasn't the director, but she ran things, organized prayer nights, broke up arguments, cleaned up messes when the world fell apart. Naomi had lost 2 sons and a husband in 1 year. She never spoke of it, only wore black, even on Sundays. Gerald didn't try to win them over. He brought groceries, fixed door hinges, built a bookshelf with his bare hands. And when the pipes burst in February, he was the one wading through ankle-deep water with a wrench and a flashlight, while others called for help that never came. But it wasn't what he did, it was how he did it. Quiet, constant, without expectation. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Gerald sat alone on the back steps of the shelter. Naomi walked out, arms crossed, her eyes tired. "Why are you really here?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. He didn't look at her when he answered. "Because I lost everything I built, and I can't build it back. But maybe I can help someone else build something new, even if I never get to live in it." Naomi didn't reply. She sat beside him, the air between them thick with words unspoken. From that night on, something shifted. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. It was reverent. Like when 2 broken souls recognize each other's pieces, the others began to open up. Not all at once. Clarice let him braid her daughter's hair when she visited. Maribel asked him to fix the leg on her sewing table. Keisha offered him a slice of sweet potato pie she usually hoarded for herself. It was Rosalind who said it first. During a group meeting, after Gerald had helped her file for housing aid, she looked at him and said, "You don't feel like a volunteer, you feel like family." And that word echoed. Family? It was a word that stung and soothed all at once. Gerald wasn't there to find love. He didn't expect to be touched again, not after burying his wife 5 winters ago. But the love that began to grow inside that shelter wasn't born of lust or fantasy. It was born of presence, of consistency, of healing. And the women, each of them, began to feel it, not as something selfish, but something sacred. And sacred things, once found, can never be ignored. Spring came late that year. Rain soaked the Louisiana clay until it swallowed shoes whole, and the shelter's roof groaned under the weight of its own patchwork repairs. Gerald had been at the shelter for 3 months when everything began to shift. The kind of shift you don't notice until it's already moved too far to ignore. It started with Clarice. One evening, after a day spent hauling donated supplies, Gerald found her sitting alone in the kitchen, head in her hands. She didn't cry. Clarice didn't do that. But her silence was loud. He poured her a glass of water and set it down without saying a word. After a long pause, she whispered, "You remind me of someone. My husband." Not his face. His silence. Gerald didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. He just sat beside her. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Clarice leaned on someone. Literally. Her head on his shoulder. It lasted 3 minutes. Maybe 4. But it was the first crack. Naomi noticed it. And then came Maribel. Her sewing machine broke down again, and Gerald stayed up until midnight fixing the motor with a flashlight in his mouth. When he was done, she touched his hand not romantically, not directly, but long enough to say, "Thank you," without words. Keisha was next. She asked him to join prayer night, then passed him a folded paper after, a note. It read, "I don't know how to feel safe around men anymore, but I feel safe around you. And that scares me." These weren't seductions. They were confessions. Wounds slowly healing under warm light. But healing is messy. And not everyone heals the same way. Naomi pulled him aside. "Gerald," she said, "I see what's happening. And I need to ask. Are you leading them on?" "No," he said without hesitation. "I'm just here." "Being here can still mean something," she said. He looked her in the eyes. "So what do I do? Leave?" She didn't answer. But the pause was long enough to mean, "Please don't." The shelter had always been a place for survival. Now it was becoming a place of feeling. And that scared people more than hunger ever did. One morning, Rosalind fell ill. Nothing serious, just the flu. Gerald sat by her bedside, reading her the Psalms. She reached out, touched his beard, and whispered, "You smell like peace." When he stood up, he caught Naomi staring from the hallway, her face unreadable. Then the rumors started. Another volunteer, an older woman who came only once a week, whispered to Miss Thelma that Gerald's getting too close to the residents, that it wasn't professional, that it could lead to scandal. Miss Thelma didn't confront him, but she asked Naomi to keep watch. Naomi tried. For a week she followed him more closely, interrupting conversations, keeping things clinical. But even she couldn't ignore the truth. Gerald wasn't taking from anyone. He was giving. Presence. Attention. Trust. That's when Naomi made a decision she couldn't unmake. She invited him to the Sunday meeting. Not the prayer circle, the private one. The 7 women met every Sunday evening to talk about their grief, their plans, their children, their pasts. No men had ever been allowed. Not even staff. But this time, Naomi said, "You've earned a seat." He sat in silence as each woman shared her story again. Only this time, not with shame, but with ownership. Yolanda talked about losing her husband to a drunk driver 2 weeks before giving birth. Danica revealed how she escaped an abusive marriage. Maribel shared how her husband had died of pneumonia, alone, in a hospital during COVID. Keisha, for the first time, admitted she hadn't cried in 4 years until Gerald showed up. Clarice didn't say much. She just looked at him and nodded. Naomi spoke last. "I brought Gerald in tonight," she said, "because I believe he's not here to fix us. He's here to remind us that we are still women, not just survivors, not just statistics, but women who can still choose." That was the moment everything broke open. From that night forward, the dynamic changed. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The women began including Gerald in more private rituals, dinner prep, late-night talks, even bedtime stories for their kids. He never crossed a line, but the line kept moving. The shelter no longer saw him as a visitor. He became part of its rhythm. When Danica's panic attacks returned, she asked only for Gerald. When Maribel dreamed of opening a sewing shop, it was Gerald who helped her write a business plan. When Rosalind cried on the anniversary of her husband's death, she didn't go to Naomi. She went to Gerald. And still he never asked for anything. which made it all the more surprising when something did happen. Not planned, not discussed, not forbidden, but not expected either. One stormy night, the power went out. Keisha, terrified of the dark since childhood, came looking for Gerald. She found him in the hallway carrying a lantern. She grabbed his hand hard and didn't let go. They sat together in the common room, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the thunder. When she finally fell asleep on his shoulder, Gerald closed his eyes and whispered, "God, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. But maybe," he thought for once, "that's okay, because something was happening here. Something sacred, something dangerous. And it was only just beginning." The weeks that followed were quiet on the surface, but beneath, something seismic stirred. The laughter during breakfast lingered a bit longer. Glances became warmer. And then one day, everything shifted. Clarice collapsed in the kitchen. It happened fast. She was slicing vegetables, humming to herself, when she suddenly dropped the knife and staggered against the counter. The bowl crashed to the floor. Gerald, who had just returned from tending the garden, sprinted in and caught her before she hit the tiles. Naomi called the nurse from the community clinic. Everyone gathered around, hearts in their throats. Clarice waved off the fuss at first, insisting it was just stress, maybe low blood sugar. But the nurse suggested a test. 2 days later, the results were in. Clarice was pregnant. She tried to hide it, tried to pretend it was a mistake, but her eyes said everything her words wouldn't. She knew. Gerald knew. Naomi knew. They all knew. That night, Clarice stood by the shelter's back porch, watching the stars. Gerald stepped beside her quietly. "I'm sorry," she said before he could speak. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "I'm not sorry," he replied, voice low and steady. Her face twisted. "You don't even know if it's yours." He turned to face her. "I don't care whose it is. You matter. That child matters. I'm not going anywhere." Clarice broke down. Years of grief, loneliness, guilt, all of it spilled out in one trembling exhale. He held her, not as a man ashamed, but as someone witnessing a miracle. But Clarice wasn't the only one. In the following weeks, more stories quietly emerged. Keisha, who had barely spoken to anyone for months, whispered to Naomi after Sunday prayers. Danica took 3 tests just to be sure before approaching Gerald in the greenhouse. Maribel cried for an hour before she found the courage to admit what her body had already confirmed. They were all pregnant. By him. One by one, the truth unfolded like dominoes. Roslyn, June, even Marisol, the most reserved, the one who still wore her late husband's wedding ring around her neck, confessed one afternoon that her cycle hadn't come in 2 months. 7 women, 7 lives growing inside them. And one man, now the center of something no one could quite name. At first, the women braced for chaos, for conflict, for rage. They expected competition, jealousy, tears, but it never came. What replaced it was silence, not the cold, awkward kind, but sacred. A shared knowing, a collective decision not to tear each other apart, but to move together. Naomi saw it happening and knew the time had come. She gathered them all in the old chapel room. The walls were lined with mismatched candles. The floor, once dusty, had been swept clean and laid with cushions and wool blankets. It looked like a sanctuary built from scraps, because that's exactly what it was. A sanctuary made from broken things that still had worth. Naomi stood before them, her hands steady. "I know what people will say," she began. "I know what the papers will write, what the church elders will whisper, but we don't live for their comfort." She looked each woman in the eye. "You are not victims. You're not naive. You made choices. We all did." Then she turned to Gerald, who stood at the back of the room, his eyes glistening with disbelief. "You didn't seduce anyone. You showed up. You stayed. You held us when we broke." She paused. "And now we're whole. No vows were spoken. No papers were signed. But in that chapel, a covenant formed, not legal, but spiritual. Not rigid, but rooted. Outside the walls, the world roared. Within days, rumors ignited in the local town. One woman claimed the shelter had become a cult. Someone spray-painted shame across the outer wall. The church board sent a formal notice questioning the shelter's operations. Naomi received veiled threats about funding being pulled. One Sunday morning, Gerald stood at the edge of the church lawn, staring at the words scrawled in red across the concrete. Miss Thelma stood beside him, trembling with rage. "They'll never understand," she whispered. Gerald didn't respond. He didn't need to. Inside, Maribel held up her ultrasound to the younger girls, who crowded around in awe. Danica and Clarice discussed baby names in hushed tones. June stitched tiny shirts in the common room using old curtains. There was fear, yes, but not regret. One night, Gerald sat alone in the hallway, overwhelmed. Naomi found him there. "I never meant for this to happen," he said. "Maybe I crossed a line." Naomi shook her head. "The line was drawn by people who don't live here, don't bleed here, don't raise children here. You didn't cross a line. You planted something, and look what's growing." That night, Rosalind took his hand at dinner. "We don't want a hero," she said simply. "We want someone who shows up, and you always do." Gerald looked around. 7 women, 7 children on the way. One heart split 7 ways, and not breaking, but expanding. And in that moment he understood. He wasn't rebuilding what he'd lost. He was becoming something new, something sacred. The news spread far beyond the town's borders. What started as whispers in church pews and corner stores soon reached reporters from nearby cities. They came with notebooks and cameras, hoping to catch something scandalous, a cult, a scandal, a fall from grace. But what they found confused them. There were no locked doors, no hysterics, no figurehead preaching submission, just a house full of women with swollen bellies, smiling without apology. Just a man in his 60s washing dishes, fixing leaks, folding baby clothes. When a news anchor asked Naomi on camera, "Do you feel exploited by this man?" she smiled gently and said, "Do I look exploited to you?" It didn't matter. The media ran with the story anyway. Miracle shelter, or moral collapse. 61-year-old man fathers, 7 children with widowed mothers. Religious house under scrutiny for spiritual polygamy. Community erupts as shelter leader refuses to step down amid scandal. But the women didn't flinch. They kept going. They painted the nursery. They sang while cooking. They braided each other's hair and made appointments at the clinic. One night, as the world outside called them immoral, Gerald stood with Clarice on the porch. She was 7 months along now and radiant in the moonlight. He held her hand, kissed her fingers. "I don't know how to protect all of you," he admitted. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You don't have to protect us. Just walk with us." Inside, Naomi had turned the chapel into a sanctuary again. Not for prayer, for planning. They began documenting everything. Every prenatal visit. Every consent form. Every witness. Not to prove they were right, but to show they had nothing to hide. But then came the real threat. A state official arrived at the door with a court order. Someone, anonymous of course, had reported unsafe living conditions and moral endangerment of minors. It was all bureaucratic language, but the threat was real. The state might intervene and separate them. That night, the women didn't cry. They gathered in the dining room, spread out papers, called attorneys, and began writing statements. One by one, they wrote letters. June: "This is my first child. I want him born where love was stronger than fear." Danica: "I lost a husband. I lost a home. Here, I found both again." Rosalind: "No man forced me. No man bought me. I chose." The next morning, Naomi drove into the city. She stood in court and read their statements aloud. Gerald wasn't there. He wasn't allowed to testify. But he waited at home with the rest, holding his breath. When Naomi returned at sunset, her face was unreadable. "They're sending someone next week," she said. "A full investigation." Everyone froze. "Then we prepare," Clarice said, "like we always do." And they did. They cleaned the entire shelter top to bottom, repaired the old fence, labeled every document, printed every photo. They lined up vitamins on the kitchen shelves, created chore charts, cleaned out the fridge. The day the inspectors arrived, they were greeted by a dozen prepared women, calm, well-dressed, pregnant, and unafraid. Gerald stood in the back, silent. He didn't speak unless spoken to. When asked about his role, he didn't give speeches. He simply said, "I support them. That's all." One inspector asked, "Do you believe in polygamy?" He replied, "I believe in responsibility." When the inspection was done, they left without saying much, just a clipboard and a nod. That night, the women finally let their shoulders drop. Naomi turned up the radio. Clarice danced barefoot on the porch. Rosalind baked something sweet. Gerald watched them and thought, maybe this wasn't a war to win. Maybe it was a home to defend. And no matter what the outside world decided, inside these walls, they had already won. Because every heartbeat in that shelter, every unborn child, wasn't born of shame. It was born of choice, born of healing, born of hope. Spring came earlier than expected that year. The mango trees outside the shelter bloomed in thick bursts, and the air smelled of rain and something sweeter. Anticipation. Clarice was the first to give birth. It happened just before dawn, her cries echoing through the house like a song they'd all been waiting for. Gerald held her hand the whole time. No doctors, just Naomi, who delivered 3 of her own years ago, and Rosalind, who'd once assisted a midwife back in her village. A boy, healthy, loud. Clarice named him Caleb. Because he was born with strength, she whispered. 2 days later, Keisha gave birth to twins. By the end of the month, 4 babies filled the nursery, their tiny lungs filling the air with life. Gerald built cribs from salvaged wood. Rosalind painted animals on the walls. Naomi crocheted little hats and booties. Each birth wasn't just a miracle, it was proof. Proof that something good could rise from ruin. That love didn't have to follow rules to be real. But the world still watched. The state official returned, this time with 2 aides and a camera crew. The footage was supposed to be documentation, but everyone knew it would be used to either vindicate or destroy them. Gerald stood in the nursery, rocking Danica's newborn while Naomi answered questions. No, she said calmly. We're not a religious cult. We're a community. Yes, she continued. We're raising these children together. And yes, he's their biological father. But we are their mothers, and that matters more. One aide walked through the shelter slowly, touching walls, taking notes. He stopped by a picture frame. It showed all the women, arms around each other, bellies round, smiles, real. He didn't say anything. That night, after the officials left, there was silence. Then a knock at the door. It was Maribel's cousin, Lucia, a woman who'd once called the shelter a shameful circus. She stood at the door, eyes rimmed with red. I need help, she said. I just left my husband. I've got nowhere else. Naomi didn't ask questions. She opened the door wider. Lucia entered. She didn't see shame. She saw safety. She saw 7 women and 1 old man cradling a newborn, humming a lullaby like it was the most natural thing in the world. The next morning, Gerald walked into the kitchen and saw a note on the table. It was from Naomi. Gerald, you came here to give, not take. But somehow, you ended up giving more than any of us expected. And still, never took more than we offered. You'll never be just one thing to us. Not just a father, not just a friend. You are the thread that wove us together. If the world never understands, so be it. We do. And we're raising children who will too. Naomi. He sat there a long time after reading it, sunlight warming his back, the sounds of babies crying and women laughing drifting through the hallway. In a world that labeled love as scandal, they had chosen to redefine it, not with ceremonies or signatures, but with morning feedings, with midnight walks, with shared laundry and shared burdens. 7 babies were born that year. One by one, the local press stopped calling. The headlines faded. The scandal became old news. But inside the shelter, life was just beginning. Lucia stayed. Then came Maria, then Lila. Women who had nothing but a suitcase and a broken past. Gerald never asked questions. He just built more cribs, planted more trees, listened when they cried, smiled when they danced. The shelter got a new name, the House of First Chances. Not second, first. Because for every woman who walked through that door, it was the first time they were truly seen, truly safe, truly loved. And at the heart of it all, a 61-year-old man who never planned to stay long, but stayed long enough to change everything. And when someone once asked him how he managed 7 women, 7 children, and a house full of chaos, Gerald just laughed. I didn't manage anything, he said. I just showed up and kept showing up.